Your world can shatter in a heartbeat. One moment you're standing on solid ground, the next, the floor drops out from under you. For Mark, that moment arrived with the screech of tires pulling into his driveway. He'd just flown back to New York City after a grueling tech conference in San Francisco, the kind that left your brain buzzing and your body aching. At 42, he felt every mile of the trip, every sleepless night fueled by lukewarm coffee and ambition. The groundbreaking ideas from the conference still swirled in his head, a storm of potential waiting to be unleashed. But as he rounded the corner onto his quiet street in the suburbs, a flash of chrome caught his eye. A low-slung silver sports car was parked in front of his house, an alien presence among the sensible SUVs and minivans that usually lined the block. Mark's gut clenched. He recognized the car. It belonged to David, his colleague, someone he'd considered a close friend, practically family. What was he doing here? A knot of unease tightened in Mark's stomach as he pulled into his own driveway. Laughter drifted from the open living room window, a sound that suddenly felt jarring, wrong. He cut the engine, his movements slow, deliberate. Easing out of the car, he moved towards the window, peering inside. What he saw stopped him dead in his tracks. Inside, Sarah, his wife of 15 years, was on the sofa with David. Too close. Her hand rested on David's arm, lingering there, possessive. Her laughter was bright, unrestrained, a sound he hadn't heard directed at him in months. The scene was a brutal tableau, more damning than any accusation. A voice, sharp and laced with ice, cut through the air. "Well, look what the cat dragged in. My disappointment of a son." It was his father, Richard, leaning against the porch railing, a sneer twisting his lips. That smirk, a familiar specter from Mark's childhood, sent a chill down his spine. "Your pal's been keeping me entertained, and the bill's paid, if you catch my drift," Richard added, a mocking chuckle in his tone. The words hit Mark like a physical blow. Rage, hot and raw, mixed with a cold, sickening betrayal. He shoved past his father, ignoring the muttered curse, and burst through the front door. The sudden intrusion shattered the cozy scene. Sarah and David sprang apart, guilt and shock flashing across their faces like neon signs. "Mark, you're home early," Sarah stammered, her voice shaky, her hands fluttering nervously at her dress. Mark didn't respond. He couldn't trust himself to speak. He turned on his heel and strode upstairs to his home office, slamming the door behind him with a force that rattled the windows. Inside, his eyes landed on the wedding portrait hanging on the wall, a frozen moment from a happier time, now a cruel joke. Slowly, deliberately, he lifted the frame, revealing the small, hidden safe behind it. With mechanical precision, he punched in the code and began emptying its contents into a briefcase. Cash, property deeds, financial statements, each item a relic of a life that now felt like a stranger's. The creak of a floorboard behind him made him spin around. Sarah stood in the doorway, her face pale, her eyes wide with panic. "You can't do this," she cried, her voice cracking. "That's ours. You can't just take it." Mark's gaze was cold, unwavering. The woman before him was no longer the partner he had known. "You'll all pay for this," he said, his voice low, each word dripping with venom. "This is just the beginning." Pushing past her, he returned to the living room. Richard and David were still there, their earlier bravado replaced by a palpable unease. Mark paused at the door, his words cutting through the strained silence like a razor. "You thought I wouldn't fight back. but you're about to learn just how wrong you were." Without another word, he left, abandoning the wreckage of his old life. As he drove, his phone buzzed incessantly with calls and messages, but he ignored them. His focus was singular, his resolve unbreakable. When the flickering neon sign of the Pineview Motel came into view, he pulled into the lot, paid in cash, checked in under a false name. Alone in the sterile motel room, Mark spread the documents from the briefcase across the bed. As he pored over them, the depth of Sarah's betrayal became sickeningly clear. Hidden accounts, irregular financial transactions, a pattern of manipulation that stretched back years. Each discovery was a fresh wound, but it also fueled his resolve. Unable to contain the storm raging inside him, Mark picked up his phone and dialed a number. "Mom," he said when she answered, his voice thick with emotion. "I need help." On the other end, Susan listened in silence as he recounted the events of the day. Her response was immediate, unwavering. "Come to me," she said firmly. "We'll figure this out together." The drive to his mother's apartment in the city was a blur. His mind raced, a chaotic mix of anger, despair, and a chilling determination. When Susan opened the door, the sight of her steady, composed, and ready brought a flicker of relief. "Let's get started," she said, pulling him inside. Susan's living room had been transformed into a war room. Papers, laptops, and charts covered every surface. A retired forensic accountant, she immediately began analyzing the documents Mark had brought. "She's been systematically undermining you for years," Susan muttered, her sharp eyes uncovering a web of damning connections. As the night wore on, a young woman entered the room. "This is Chloe," Susan said. "She's a cybersecurity expert. We'll need her expertise to dig deeper." Chloe wasted no time, her fingers flying across the keyboard. "We need to be thorough," she warned. "This has to be airtight if you take legal action." Within hours, Chloe had unearthed incriminating emails between David and Sarah, exposing a tangled web of deception that reached into both Mark's personal and professional life. As the first light of dawn crept through the windows, Mark sat back, exhaustion battling with a newfound sense of purpose. Looking at Susan and Chloe, he felt something he hadn't felt in days: hope. "They thought they could destroy me," he said quietly, his voice steady, edged with steel. "But they're about to find out just how wrong they were." Susan and Chloe exchanged a silent look, their unspoken understanding sharpened by the tension in Mark's voice. The air crackled with a shift in power, a brewing storm the others were oblivious to. As the first rays of dawn painted the city skyline, Mark stood and stretched, the weight of the previous day pressing heavily on him. Yet, he refused to break. A reckoning was coming, and he was ready. The man Mark had been, the loyal husband, the trusting friend, the dutiful son, had vanished. In his place stood someone forged in betrayal, hardened by deceit, and ready to fight. Robert Thompson, CEO of Global Tech Innovations, sat in his penthouse office, surrounded by the gleaming trophies of his success. The panoramic view of the Manhattan skyline served as a constant reminder of his climb to the top. Over the years, he'd mentored many young talents, but few had shown the raw potential Mark once possessed. When Robert's secretary informed him of Mark's unexpected visit, he welcomed him warmly. But the moment Mark stepped into the office, Robert knew something was wrong. The usual warmth in Mark's demeanor was gone, replaced by an icy resolve that sent a shiver down his spine. Without preamble, Mark began. I need your help. You deserve to know the truth about David. Robert's expression darkened as he leaned back in his leather chair. What are you talking about, Mark? Mark opened his briefcase and laid a stack of documents on the mahogany desk. As Robert scanned the papers, his face grew paler with each page. Project proposals riddled with fraudulent schemes, designs Mark had meticulously created now bearing David's signature, safety reports glossing over critical emissions. This is catastrophic, Robert muttered, his voice shaking as he held up a particularly damning document. The implications for the company are massive. Mark's nod was grim. It's worse than you think. David's been stealing my designs, falsifying bids, and ignoring safety protocols for years, and he's had accomplices. Over the next hour, Mark laid bare the full extent of the conspiracy, David's betrayal, the intricate web of corruption, and the powerful figures who had enabled him. By the time Mark finished, Robert looked as if the weight of the revelations had aged him a decade. What do you want from me? Robert asked, his voice barely a whisper. Your influence, Mark said. Your connections. This needs to come to light, but it can't be traced back to me. Not yet. Robert nodded, his mind already racing. We'll start with the Industry Licensing Board. Strategic anonymous tips. They'll have no choice but to investigate. In the days that followed, Mark and Robert worked tirelessly, compiling irrefutable evidence and submitting carefully crafted anonymous reports. These reports meticulously detailed David's fraudulent history and ethical violations, striking at the very heart of his reputation. Meanwhile, Mark prepared for the next phase of his plan, a high-profile charity gala, the perfect stage for his subtle attack. With an easy smile and a champagne flute in hand, Mark mingled through the crowd, planting seeds of doubt among key attendees. Have you heard about the probe into global tech? He asked in a conspiratorial tone. Let's just say it's not a name I'd want to be associated with right now. The whispers spread like wildfire, fanning the flames of scandal. Each hushed conversation added to the growing unease, and David's once sterling reputation began to crumble. Simultaneously, Chloe launched her own offensive. Her fingers danced across her keyboard as she hacked into David's email account. Moments later, her triumphant grin spoke volumes. I found it, she announced, waving Mark over. Mark's gaze hardened as he scanned the incriminating correspondence. Forward the most damning ones to his top clients. Anonymously, he instructed. Let's ensure his collapse is absolute. The fallout was swift and devastating. Within weeks, David's office, once a hive of activity, became eerily silent. Clients vanished, bids were rejected, and the man who once dominated industry gatherings now skulked in obscurity, his confidence shattered. But Mark's campaign was far from over. Susan's apartment, their operational headquarters, was littered with documents and open laptops. Susan, the forensic accountant, unraveled a web of financial crimes. This is bigger than we thought, she said, her voice tight with controlled anger. David, Sarah, and several shell companies have been laundering money for years. Mark's jaw tightened. How much? Millions, Susan whispered. They've siphoned it from your accounts, project budgets, everywhere. Mark's expression hardened. Then it's time to shut them down. The next morning, Mark met with Jennifer Davis, head of fraud at City National Bank. For 2 hours, he laid out his findings, bank statements, transaction logs, and a detailed timeline of the embezzlement. By the end, Jennifer was visibly shaken. We'll freeze all shared accounts and credit lines immediately, she assured him. Sarah won't see another cent. That evening, Chloe's surveillance system triggered an alert. Sarah just tried to check into the plaza. she reported, a triumphant smirk on her face. Her cards were declined. Every single one. Mark allowed himself a small, cold smile as he imagined her panic. But the next morning, his focus shifted again. As he sat with his lawyer, Amelia Rodriguez, in her sleek downtown office, Mark declared, "I want a divorce." His tone was resolute. "Infidelity and financial fraud." Amelia arched an eyebrow but nodded. "With this evidence, she won't get a dime." As Amelia began drafting the divorce papers, Chloe burst into the room. "You need to see this," she said, placing her laptop on the desk. "Richard's emails reveal he's been taking bribes to greenlight unsafe building permits. It's a full-scale zoning scandal." Mark's eyes burned with determination. The storm he'd unleashed was just beginning, and he wasn't stopping until the devastation was complete. Mark's eyes narrowed as he reviewed the damning emails. These were the keys to dismantling Richard's world, but deploying them required precision. After a tense exchange of ideas, the plan solidified. Mark would anonymously contact Agent Miller, an ambitious FBI agent he had worked with on a previous case. Miller, eager to make a name for himself with a high-stakes corruption case, wouldn't hesitate to dive into the tangled web of Richard's illicit dealings. The aftermath was swift and brutal. As whispers of the investigation spread, Richard's political allies scrambled to distance themselves. His once unassailable city council campaign imploded overnight. The man who had scorned Mark as a failure now teetered on the brink of indictment. Watching the media coverage of Richard's public disgrace, Mark's emotions churned. Satisfaction at seeing justice prevail warred with the bitter sorrow of knowing family bonds had been irrevocably shattered by greed and betrayal. Yet, he shoved those feelings aside. This was no time for sentimentality. The storm he had set in motion was only beginning to rage. Late one night, a thunderous banging on Mark's apartment door jolted him awake. Checking the security monitor Chloe had installed, he smirked. There they were, Sarah, David, and Richard, huddled anxiously in the hallway. Right on cue, he thought, activating the hidden cameras around the apartment. He opened the door with measured calm and stepped back, allowing the trio to barge in. Sarah's typically impeccable appearance was in tatters, her makeup streaked by tears. David's wild eyes darted around the room like a cornered animal, while Richard's barely contained fury simmered beneath a veneer of forced composure. "You've destroyed us!" David barked, lunging towards Mark, fists clenched. Sarah grabbed his arm, holding him back. "How could you do this to your own family?" she sobbed, tears spilling freely. "We were supposed to stand by each other." Mark let out a sharp, bitter laugh. "Family? Support? Is that what you call sleeping with my supposed friend and sabotaging my career by stealing my work?" Richard stepped forward, his voice a venomous growl. "You ungrateful little—" Mark cut him off with icy precision. "You mean like taking bribes to greenlight unsafe construction projects? Putting countless lives at risk just to line your pockets?" Richard's face drained of color. "How do you know about—" Mark didn't reply. Instead, he retrieved a device from his desk and pressed a button. The room filled with the incriminating sounds of Sarah and David laughing about their affair and Richard casually discussing bribes. The three froze, their faces masks of shock and fear. "I'm just getting started," Mark said, his voice as cold as ice. "Every lie, every betrayal, it all comes out now." Blinded by rage, David lunged at Mark again, but Mark easily sidestepped, sending David sprawling into a nearby table. The crash added another layer of chaos to the tableau. As the trio stood in stunned silence, Mark delivered his final words like a blade. "You thought I was weak, a failure. Remember this moment when you realize how wrong you were." They left without another word, the fight draining out of them like air from a punctured tire. As the door clicked shut, Mark let out a shaky breath, his meticulously executed plan leaving him both triumphant and emotionally gutted. He collapsed into a chair, feeling the crushing weight of weeks of relentless tension. The storm he had unleashed was reaching its zenith, and there was no retreat. Oh. For a fleeting moment, Mark allowed himself to grieve, not for his enemies, but for the trust and innocence he had lost forever. Tomorrow, the battle would rage on, but tonight he let the grief wash over him. City Hall, with its imposing granite facade and hallowed halls, stood as the heart of the city. Tonight, it would become the stage for a final reckoning. Backstage, Mark's heart hammered against his ribs as the murmur of the gathering crowd reached him through the heavy velvet curtains. Clutched in his hand was a USB drive, its contents the weapon that would finally unravel the web of lies that had poisoned his life. Peering through a gap in the curtains, he spotted Sarah, David, and Richard seated near the front, their fidgeting betraying their mounting unease. They had no idea what was about to unfold. The mayor's lengthy introduction felt interminable, but at last, Mark's name was called. Steeling himself, he stepped into the blinding spotlight. "Good evening," he began, his voice steady, amplified by the microphone. "Thank you for being here tonight. We're not just discussing urban renewal, we're addressing a deeper need for renewal, of trust, of integrity." A ripple of confusion passed through the crowd. Mark's gaze locked onto Sarah's, catching the flicker of raw fear in her eyes. She should be afraid, he thought grimly. With a click of the remote, the first slide appeared on the giant screen behind him. Gasps echoed through the hall as Richard's bribe receipts, David's stolen designs juxtaposed with Mark's originals, and Sarah's embezzlement records flashed into view. The audience sat stunned, a collective intake of breath filling the room. "For years," Mark continued, his voice rising with resolve, "our community has been betrayed by those we trusted most. My father, Richard Clark, took bribes to approve unsafe buildings, endangering countless lives. My supposed friend, David Miller, stole my designs and claimed them as his own, all while carrying on an affair with my wife. And Sarah, my wife, embezzled funds from community projects meant to help us all." The crowd erupted into a storm of outrage. Richard turned ashen, David looked ready to faint, and Sarah openly wept, her carefully constructed composure shattered. Mark continued, undeterred. At the back of the room, he noticed local journalist Jessica Chen live-streaming the event. The scandal was no longer confined to City Hall. It was spreading like wildfire across the city. Members of the audience began to stand, their voices rising, sharing their anger, their personal grievances. "My brother was injured when that unsafe building collapsed," a woman shouted, her glare fixed on Richard. "You approved those permits. You knew." "What about the missing youth center funds?" another man cried, his voice thick with betrayal. "Sarah, you lied to all of us." Mark remained firm, his voice cutting through the rising tide of chaos. This was the reckoning he had fought for. As he stepped down from the stage, a grim sense of accomplishment settled over him. The battle was won, though the war was far from over. The lives of those who had wronged him lay in ruins, their downfall a stark warning to anyone who dared to cross him again. It had always been about justice. As accusations surged through the crowded hall, Sarah, David, and Richard seemed to physically shrink under the weight of the revealed truth. Their eyes darted frantically, filled with panic as their carefully constructed facade crumbled into dust. In a desperate attempt to escape, they bolted for the exit, but the furious crowd surged forward, blocking their path. Reporters, drawn by Jessica's live stream, descended like vultures, their cameras capturing every desperate moment. From his vantage point on the stage, Mark stood watching as the three people who had betrayed him so profoundly were engulfed by the chaos. A flicker of satisfaction stirred within him, a small, quiet vindication. Yet, beneath it, something heavier settled, a profound sadness for what might have been. It wasn't regret exactly, but the bittersweet ache of what was now irrevocably lost. The battle unfolding in the hall no longer belonged to him. He stepped away from the stage, slipping unnoticed into the shadows. Outside, Mark paused, the cool night air filling his lungs. The crushing burden of lies and deceit that had haunted him for months seemed to lift with each breath. The revelation was complete, and a new chapter awaited. For the first time in what felt like an eternity, Mark believed he could begin again. The aftermath of that fateful night at City Hall was swift and brutal. Media coverage was relentless, and the wheels of the legal system began to grind, tightening their grip on the guilty. Mark, unexpectedly thrust into the spotlight, found himself besieged by questions from journalists and investigators alike. Then, amidst the whirlwind, a call came that changed everything. "Mr. Clark, this is Anya Petrova from Global Eco Design in Moscow." A calm, deliberate voice introduced itself. Mark's brow furrowed in confusion. "Ms. Petrova, I'm not sure what this is about." "I've seen your designs, Mr. Clark," she explained. "The ones David Miller falsely claimed as his own. Your work is groundbreaking. At Global Eco Design, we're seeking someone with your vision to lead a pioneering, eco-friendly development in Dubai." A wave of emotions washed over Mark. Disbelief, pride, and a cautious glimmer of hope he thought had long since died. "I'm honored, Miss Petrova, but how did you find me?" "The scandal has drawn global attention," she replied. "Your courage in exposing corruption, combined with the brilliance of your work, has made waves in our industry. At GED, we value fresh starts and transformative ideas." Her words sparked something within Mark, a sense of possibility he hadn't felt in years. As she outlined the ambitious project, the idea of rebuilding his career, his life, on his own terms, began to feel tangible. "I'll need some time to consider your offer," he said, his mind already racing with possibilities. "Take all the time you need, Mr. Clark," she assured him. "We're confident you're the right choice." After the call ended, Mark sat quietly, absorbing the weight of the opportunity. Almost instinctively, he found himself driving to his childhood home in Westchester, a place that once embodied comfort and belonging, but now stood as a faded reminder of the past. The house was weathered and empty, its hollow silence a stark contrast to the warmth of his memories. Dust hung in the air, settling on the bare floors where furniture had once stood. As Mark stepped inside, the front door creaked open, a reluctant welcome. The house felt smaller than he remembered, diminished by the disillusionment of recent events. From the shadows of the porch a figure emerged. Sarah. Her face was pale and drawn, her expression a mask of guilt. "Mark?" she began, her voice quivering. "I've changed. Can't we try again?" Her outstretched hand met only silence. As Mark studied her, he saw not the woman he had once loved, but a stranger wearing her face. "That time has passed, Sarah," he said softly, but firmly. "I'm no longer the man you thought you could manipulate." Tears welled in her eyes, But Mark had no solace left to give. He stepped past her, intent on gathering the last of his belongings. Before he could leave, David stumbled through the front door, disheveled and reeking of stale liquor. "Mark," David pleaded, dropping to his knees. "I'll confess everything. I'll take the blame. Just please, call off the lawyers. I'm finished." Mark regarded him with a mixture of pity and cold resolve. "Your confession changes nothing, David. The truth has already taken on a life of its own." Moments later, Richard arrived, parking haphazardly in the driveway. The three of them, Sarah, David, and Richard, stood before Mark in the empty house, their shared guilt hanging in the air like a suffocating fog. Mark met their eyes, his voice steady but resolute. "I wanted you to see what your actions have created," he said. "This empty house is a monument to the lies you built your lives on." Sarah flinched, her gaze darting across the room as if searching for remnants of a better time. David hung his head, unable to meet Mark's eyes, while Richard stared defiantly, though the tremor in his hands betrayed him. "I've made my decision," Mark declared. "I'm accepting an offer in Dubai, a chance to build something real." "You're leaving?" Sarah's voice cracked, barely a whisper. Mark nodded. "I'm moving forward. I don't need your forgiveness, nor do I offer mine. The past stays here." He let the words sink in before delivering his final statement. "I've donated a significant portion of the recovered assets to a foundation for victims of fraud and betrayal. It seemed fitting." The weight of his words crushed the room into silence. Sarah wept quietly. David appeared utterly defeated, and Richard's face reddened with suppressed rage. Finally, Richard broke the silence, his voice low and uncharacteristically soft. "Son, I was wrong about you, about everything." Mark's gaze lingered on his father's face, searching intently for even the faintest hint of deceit. For perhaps the first time in Richard's chaotic history, his words bore the unmistakable weight of honesty. Mark gave a small nod, a gesture that acknowledged the statement, but stopped well short of absolution. "Goodbye," he said quietly, his voice steady as he turned towards the door. Stepping out onto the porch, Mark left behind the broken fragments of his former existence. The evening sky stretched before him, painted in hues of fiery orange and soft pink, a fittingly poetic backdrop for the significance of this moment. As he descended the steps, a strange and unfamiliar lightness began to settle over him, a sensation he hadn't experienced in years. Sliding into the driver's seat, he paused before starting the engine, letting his eyes rest briefly on the house through the rearview mirror. What had once stood as the cornerstone of his world now appeared diminished, a distant relic of a life he was prepared to leave behind. The car's engine hummed to life, and as the New York City skyline receded in his mirror, Mark directed his focus forward. The road stretched endlessly ahead, a journey veiled in uncertainty. He knew recovering from betrayal wouldn't be easy. The scars left by misplaced trust ran deep, and regaining the ability to trust others would be a slow and arduous process. But with each passing mile, a new sensation began to stir within him, a delicate yet undeniable sense of possibility. As he drove further from the life he was leaving behind, Mark reached a quiet understanding. True triumph didn't lie in vengeance against those who had hurt him. Instead, it was found in rising above their actions, in crafting a life so full and untouchable that their betrayal no longer held any power over him. What lay ahead was a future untainted by bitterness, a blank canvas awaiting his design. With each fleeting glimpse of his old life disappearing in the mirror, Mark felt the beginnings of a cautious smile forming. The storm had passed, and though its aftermath would take time to mend, he finally held the freedom to navigate his own course. The road stretched out endlessly, leading him toward Dubai and the unpredictable challenges and opportunities that awaited. For the first time in years, Mark Clark felt a flicker of hope, fragile yet unyielding, guiding him toward a future of his own making.